Let's jump right into this explainer and investigate one of the most credible, data-backed mass anomaly sightings in modern history. We're going back to January 8th, 2008, when something absolutely extraordinary happened in the sky over a small Texas town. Now, we aren't just relying on blurry photos or some lone driver on a dark road here. We're looking at a case backed by raw radar data, official military flip-flops, and dozens of highly reliable witnesses. Our goal today is to strip away all the sensationalism and strictly examine the documented facts, the hard data, and the real human toll of what we now call the Stephenville incident. Picture a quiet, flatland Texas town with a population of around 17,000 people. It sits about 80 miles southwest of Fort Worth, and the residents of Stephenville are very, very familiar with their skies. Because of the nearby Brownwood military operating area, the locals know exactly what an F-16 fighter jet looks and sounds like. They know commercial planes, they have these big open skies with almost zero light pollution. But what they saw on this crisp winter night completely defied any conventional explanation. And it wasn't just one isolated person either. It was a collective experience that essentially changed this town forever. Section 1. Credible eyes on the sky. The witnesses who had everything to lose. So we're talking about an incident that involved over 40 distinct, highly credible eyewitnesses. Multiple unconnected residents across Erith County experienced these consistent, totally baffling sightings throughout the exact same evening. Right at 6:15 p.m., Steve Allen, who is a pilot with 30 years of flight experience, by the way, saw high-intensity strobing lights moving at an estimated 3,000 miles per hour in absolute dead silence. 10 minutes later, observers noted incredibly loud F-16 military jets streaking through the sky, seemingly chasing this silent object. Then, an hour later, just down the road in Dublin, Constable Leroy Gaitan walked out to his car and saw massive red orbs hovering in the sky. They vanished and then instantly reappeared as a cluster of impossibly fast, flashing lights. The physical descriptions from that night are just as wild. Local machinist Ricky Sorrells was actually out deer hunting when he saw the craft hover roughly 300 feet over his pasture. He specifically noted the total lack of conventional aerospace manufacturing. No bolts, no rivets, no welded seams, just a perfectly smooth, sandy gray surface. Other witnesses described a craft that was completely silent, potentially a mile long and a half-mile wide, covered in blinding strobe lights that some people said looked like dirty, burning flames. The specific details provided by these witnesses point to an anomaly entirely stripped of standard aviation markers. Think about it. You have a massive object. Witnesses literally compared it to the size of several football fields or even a mile long, emitting these intense, xenon-like lights. But the most baffling characteristic reported by almost everyone was the physics. It moved at blinding speeds, it was capable of instantaneous acceleration, but it made absolutely zero sound. There was no jet engine roar, no rotor wash, and crucially, no sonic boom when it accelerated out of sight. Section 2. The military's changing story. From denial to administrative error. Now, here is where things get really interesting, because the way authorities responded adds a massive layer of complexity to this mystery. There is a dramatic juxtaposition between the military's initial, absolute denial and their sudden reversal 16 days later. On January 14th, spokespeople from the 301st Fighter Wing and nearby bases categorically denied having any aircraft in the sky that night. They actually suggested the town simply saw sunlight reflecting off a commercial airliner. But fast forward to January 23rd, and they completely flipped their story. Suddenly, the Air Force releases a statement admitting that 10 F-16s were in fact running training missions over that exact area, and they blamed their initial denial on an internal communications problem. Section 3. Hard radar evidence. Freedom of Information Act reveals the data. So investigators didn't just take people's word for it. They filed Freedom of Information Act requests for the raw FAA radar data. Independent investigators with MUFON, specifically former Army radar system specialist Glenn Schultz and researcher Robert Powell, spent months combing through over 3 million raw radar returns. That's 2.5 million lines of unedited, unabridged data from 5 different FAA and weather antennas. They weren't looking at summaries. They were looking at the exact raw data points recorded that evening. When you map this data out, the picture is undeniable. It confirmed an object lacking a transponder that vastly outperformed the F-16s tracked in the exact same airspace. The raw data recorded an unknown skin paint return, which means an actual physical object reflecting radar, not an electronic transponder signal. At one point, this unknown object was clocked moving at approximately 1,900 miles per hour. An F-16 with full afterburners maxes out around 1,500 miles per hour. The radar showed the object slowing down, accelerating, and even vanishing entirely from the radar before reappearing, basically behaving in ways conventional aircraft simply cannot. And it doesn't stop there. Analysts used geographic triangulation based on the witness's compass directions. Dr. Ted Ackworth, a mechanical engineer formerly with NASA, took the exact geographical locations and sightlines of 4 independent witnesses from that night. When he maps their line of sight, they all intersected at the exact same physical spot in the sky, about 1,500 feet in the air, a few miles east of town. So this mathematically proved that multiple observers miles apart were looking at the exact same very real physical object. Section 4. Intimidation and personal toll. The high cost of the truth. Despite all this hard data, coming forward took a severe toll on the residents of Stephenville, and this grounds the story in a pretty harsh human reality. Ricky Sorrells detailed immense harassment after his daytime sighting. He reported that low-flying military helicopters continuously gridded over his property day and night, terrorizing his animals and his family. One night, a trespasser in a parka was spotted standing near his back door, and they left behind a single rifle bullet as a message. Most chillingly of all, Sorrells received a phone call from a man claiming to be an Air Force lieutenant colonel, demanding he stop talking to the press, and threatening him directly. "Son, we have the same caliber weapons as you do, but a lot more of them." This human element powerfully demonstrates why this matters so much. Witnesses like Steve Allen weren't seeking fame. Their pursuit of understanding fundamentally fractured their everyday lives. Allen was a successful freight entrepreneur with a thriving marriage. But after seeing the object, his obsession with finding the truth completely consumed him. He lost the trust of his employees, his massive trucking company suffered, and the stress dissolved his 17-year marriage. These witnesses had absolutely zero incentive to lie, because telling the truth pretty much cost them everything. A heavy silence soon descended upon Stephenville, which perfectly mirrors a documented pattern we see, where intense public interest is quickly followed by a total information vacuum. Angelia Joyner, the intrepid local reporter who first broke the story, abruptly left her job at the newspaper under really murky circumstances. The national media circus packed up and went home. Witnesses, feeling intimidated and exhausted, just stopped speaking to the press. And despite millions of radar data points and blatant military contradictions, no official congressional inquiry was ever launched into what actually happened. Section 5. An enduring mystery. Balancing the perspectives. So, where does that leave us today? We are left with a fierce dialectic. On one side, we have scientific skepticism championed by figures like SETI astronomer Dr. Seth Shostak, who argues that jumping straight to extraterrestrials is premature, noting that extreme military secrecy or experimental craft could easily be to blame. But on the other side, the investigative view from radar analysts points out that an object traveling 1,900 miles per hour with no transponder, emitting zero sound, and capable of hovering silently simply defies all known human technological capabilities. But here is a wild fact that completely elevates the stakes of this entire debate. Whatever this silent behemoth was, it was heading straight for one of the most highly protected airspace zones in the entire country. The radar data tracked the object moving directly toward Crawford, Texas. At the time, this was the location of the Western White House, the private ranch of then-President George W. Bush. For an unidentified, transponderless object to fly unimpeded toward presidential airspace without a massive public military interception, that raises huge, undeniable questions about national security. What you really need to take away from this explainer is the unsettling gap between what was undeniably recorded and what was officially explained. We have a town full of credible witnesses, we have hard radar returns tracking impossible speeds, and we have a military that changed its story. So as we wrap things up, I want to leave you with this to ponder. If the data is real and the people are telling the truth, what exactly was moving through the Texas sky that night? And honestly, what does it mean that those in power have never felt the need to give us a straight answer?